If you want people to care about something, they need to experience it. So part of restoring nature, a really important part, is making sure that everybody has equal access to it.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm very excited to be here with Rene Olivieri, who is chair of the National Trust, which I think is probably the most important nature recovery organization in Britain today. Rene, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Happy to be here.
And I think the timing is great, certainly from the perspective of this conversation, this podcast, because it's only 2 weeks since the National Trust announced a massive new nature plan. I think the headline was, National Trust is going to restore healthy nature or vibrant nature across an area the size of Greater London. And so that's what I'd love to talk about. But before we do, let's just talk a little bit about the National Trust itself. You obviously love the organization as its chair. I do too. I've been in awe of the National Trust since I was a teenager, not least since it became apparent to me that the reason why Britain has so much coastline that is still green and wild and open is because the National Trust many decades ago set about buying up the coastline and preventing suburban sprawl. And therefore we have this extraordinary coast, especially in the south coast of England, Somerset, where I'm from, Devon. I think the coastal project is possibly one of the most important conservation moves made by any group ever. So let's talk a little bit about that, Rene, and about the origins of the National Trust and what the organization is really about.
So you know that I believe, the National Trust believes, that history and nature belong together. You can't understand natural history without understanding human history. And so it is with the National Trust as well. And that understanding of the history gives you a good appreciation for where you are at this point in time and where you're going. So if you want to know what the National Trust is trying to do over the next 10, 50 years, you've got to first roll back to where we were founded. And actually, I roll the story back even earlier than that. And I kind of think the National Trust started with the Industrial Revolution. So we all know the Industrial Revolution was this amazing thing that launched 1,000 technological ships, 1,000 inventions, and actually made the world a wealthier place. It's in technological progress. We'd had improvement in living standards. We'd had improvement in people's health. So a lot of good things came from the Industrial Revolution. And we should celebrate it. Britain was a leader of that. But there were some downstream problems created by that. You had greater pollution of the air, you had greater pollution of the water, destruction of the countryside, the exploitation of resources, and of course, the biggie out there that no one could really have predicted at the time, climate change. Our founders saw that people were being pushed more and more into cities and lacked access to green, open spaces. So they were basically being closed off from the countryside. And the countryside was being potentially overdeveloped. So they basically took action to provide for the landless people, particularly people living in urban areas, access to those green spaces. And that led to first some acquisitions, some small land acquisitions. And then in 1907, I think it was, a parliamentary act allowed the National Trust to make its property, some of its properties, inalienable. And once we had this inalienability behind us, that we were going to look after things for future generations in perpetuity, then a lot of people started to help us to acquire land in the Lake District, on the coastline, and we began to become a repository for special landscapes, special places that people wanted to protect forever. Then comes the destruction of the great country house. Very difficult for people to keep up these enormous places in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and even into the 50s. The Country House Act, again, from Parliament, gave special tax incentives to people to gift those places, to pass those places on to the National Trust. So suddenly, we're looking after not just all we did from the very beginning, but suddenly the built heritage becomes really important to us as well. And a lot of these big country estates, we started to look after. Then the event that we only had a couple of 100,000 members. Revenues were maybe £1 million a year in the early 60s, when people identified that, geographer identified in particular, that our coastline was going to be submerged under development in caravan parks and be lost really to the British public. Project Neptune was a project to raise money and to preserve that coastline. And now we've got about 800 miles of it that we look after. You roll on to the present day, and now the National Trust looks after 500 historic sites. It has 5.4 million members, which makes it one of the biggest membership organizations in the UK. It is the largest conservation, as you said at the outset, the largest conservation organization, not just in the UK, but in Europe. We spend £180 million a year on conservation projects, looking after 1 million different objects and 250,000 hectares of precious British landscape.
What a story. And it coincides with this kind of great psychic reconnection with nature that began in the Industrial Revolution. Of course, the railways were built and suddenly every town and village was accessible from the cities by railway, and people were encouraged to get out into nature. The National Trust has really traced the progress of that movement from the start. But still today, when you talk to people who aren't necessarily close to the nature movement about the National Trust, they think country houses. They think beautiful tapestries and paintings, and they're walking around the halls of these extraordinary buildings. And often people don't realize that the National Trust is actually, in my view, the most important nature organization in the country because of the scale of the space that the National Trust oversees. What I find so fascinating is that this big, you'd say conservative with a small c, or at least seen to be conservative, establishment organization with its own act of parliament, as you describe, should at the same time have a pretty radical vision for nature recovery in this country. And that is something I think to be incredibly optimistic about. For those of us who know that Britain is one of the most nature depleted places on earth, I grew up imagining that wildlife is kind of something that you go abroad to experience. It's not something for here in Britain. But the National Trust doesn't have that view. The National Trust has this grand plan, this big plan that has kind of been underway for a number of years, even before the big announcement. So could you possibly elaborate a bit, Rene, on what you're going to do?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is our new strategy isn't just about what we're going to do. It's very easy and comfortable for charitable organizations to pursue their charitable purpose from the inside out, to say, these are the things we look after, these are the things that we can do with the resources and the people we have available. What we've tried to do in our new strategy is invert that. We've tried to take advantage of our independence. We're financially independent. We're not beholden to any organization. Our relative size, the expertise that we have, to basically, this is a challenge that we've given to the whole country. We know that nature has been in decline for many years. Ben, you've been doing a lot to try to counteract that and to make people aware of it. So even though we feel we're doing pretty good on our 2% or so of the land that we look after, we're not going to turn around the decline of nature on our own. And to my mind, it's just as important if we want people to care about these places. David Attenborough is a great advocate of this. If you want people to care about something, they need to experience it. So part of restoring nature, a really important part, is making sure that everybody has equal access to it. And that we feel the same way about heritage as well. A lot of the work that we're going to be doing in future will be beyond our walls, outside our boundaries, working with other organizations to achieve a goal for the nation. We're there for the nation. We're not there just for members. As much as we love them and much as we depend on them, we're here to provide a benefit to everyone in the nation.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. I think within the context of that, creating access for people into nature, and that's a bit that I want to talk about more than the work that's going on in the built fabric of your estate. some of the ideas that are being put forward and executed are pretty cutting edge. I mean, the first time I heard, for example, about stage 0 river restoration, which, like you, is an idea that emerges from the west coast of the United States. The idea of taking a artificially straightened, canalized stream or river and kind of filling it in and allowing the water to run in multi-braided channels across a floodplain. I mean, that is, in a British context, that is pretty radical. And yet the National Trust has pioneered this. And I had Mike Blackmore from the Wessex Rivers Trust on the podcast not so long ago. And he acknowledges the National Trust has been pretty avant-garde when it comes to looking at a landscape and throwing off any preconceptions one might have about that landscape and allowing nature to flourish using some of these fast start, or what you might describe as, I know the National Trust doesn't use the term rewilding, but in a way, these are rewilding techniques. So how has that come about? How has such an establishment organization been so bold in some of those projects?
I think, we do have a lot of experts. We do have a lot of experience. But I think, it's interesting that you mentioned water. I'm not allowed to be particularly enthusiastic about any type of environment or any type of habitat. But I really get excited about things that involve water, because water is a great restorative. It's really a hugely important thing with I like the idea of thinking of things in terms of catchments. I like the idea of thinking that re-wetting the peatlands, which we know just re-wetting them can do an enormous amount to restore them and to store carbon. And the UK has a huge proportion of peatlands. Take Holnacott in Somerset. We both love the fact that the beavers are flourishing there. And I have to tell you that my home state, Oregon, the mascot is the beaver. So I grew up, didn't ever see any beavers, but I could always see their action in the areas that I grew up in the Deschutes River. Anyway, Holnacott is a classic example about how you can use nature to do the heavy lifting. And if you look back to see what nature was doing before, there were reasons that it was flourishing so successfully. So just basically letting the beavers do their work, letting the water to spread out. We've done an analysis. It's only started this project 4 years ago. An analysis by scientists showed that we've had, this is going to sound impossible, a 1,700% increase in biodiversity there. We're getting, otters are showing up occasionally. We're getting lampreys, and we're getting grass snakes, trout, all kinds of bird species. The swallows are, have a feeding frenzy with the insects at times. And even the green sandpiper, which you'll know is an indicator of wetland health, is showing up. So it didn't take a lot to do. We basically let the beavers and the river do its thing, and voila, you get this amazing increase in biodiversity in a very short period of time.
Yeah, the Devon beaver study that was run by the University of Exeter counted a 16,000% increase in amphibian abundance in quite a short period of time. Now, beavers are the keystone of all keystone species. We've talked about them a lot in this podcast series. But about my visit to Holnacott, I was lucky enough to be shown around by Kev Davis, who's a legend. He's the leader of the nature recovery team there. And I was blown away by the scale of this landscape project. I mean, this is, I can't remember the number, but it's thousands of acres in which natural processes are being allowed to play out. So beavers have returned to the watercourses, which have been restored. There are water buffalo now, which are doing their own thing and grazing and browsing and trampling and wallowing and digging along that watercourse. All kinds of rare bird species that were previously not known in that landscape are coming back. There are Exmoor ponies. There are heavy native cattle. It's kind of a rewilding dream, although it doesn't use the term rewilding. I want to talk a little bit about livelihoods, because that kind of ambitious project isn't always popular. We know from Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy report that was published in 2021 that about 85% of the food we produce in this country comes from about a fifth of the land. And we also know that the least productive fifth of the land, which pretty much overlays our national parks, produces somewhere in the region of 1 or perhaps 2% of the food. So they're not producing any amount of food that makes a dent in our national food production. So there's no food security argument for dialing back the intensity of farming in our national parks. But there are strong livelihood reasons to figure out a pathway for economic and social renewal. Now, the average farmer, I understand it, in our national parks, mostly they're raising sheep, are in their 70s. The younger generation don't really want to do it. They're not producing a particularly decent income. I think the net income of the average upland sheep farmer in Britain is somewhere around £7,000 or £8,000, which is way beneath the living wage. So it's not really working for anyone, the current model of sheep monocultures in our least productive landscapes, places like Olnacut, places like the Lake District, places like the Yorkshire Dales, Bodmin. All over the country, we've got these protected, precious landscapes that are grazed to bits by sheep that are terribly ecologically depleted, and yet they're not producing a decent livelihood for people. But those culture in those places is incredibly important. These communities are the soul and the backbone of great swathes of our country. So the question is, how does the National Trust look at that? How do we bring back swathes of vibrant mosaic habitat of woodlands and wetlands, grazed with native livestock, kind of cattle, belted Galloways, longhorns, maybe Exmoor ponies or other rare breed ponies, whilst breathing new life back into the economy of these places so that people can stay on the land? Now, how do you look at that as an organization?
Let's go back to John Lawton. The Lawton Report of 15 years ago. I think that was, for me, a kind of transformative moment when he came up with this conclusion, which has really been a mantra, I think, for the whole sector. Bigger, better, more and more joined up. And I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good or the better. I would much rather see all of the land in Britain improved on a continuous basis than think that just on a few bits of land, a few reserves, we're going to make these perfect oases. So it's a question of finding the right balance, working with communities, working with farmers, and for, it seems to me, governments to recognize the downstream benefits, the externalities, the positive externalities, as well as the negative externalities that farming produces. A great amount of the land here, a great deal of the land here, is not suitable for farming. We estimate on National Trust land that something like only 5% is really suitable for farming. And so why not be using that marginal land to create other benefits? And of course, you can't continue to intensify the exploitation of the land indefinitely, because actually the soil gets knackered and you have to work harder and harder to get the same output. So I'm a farm boy. I grew up on a farm. I know how hard they work. I know how much they care about their animals and their crops, and they're proud about their productivity. I know about the financial uncertainty as we move to a new subsidy system. We just need to recognize that they provide huge benefits, that they can be the stewards of the countryside. There is no path to restoring nature which doesn't involve the farmers and the landowners. So let's have those conversations. Let's understand the economics of local communities. Let's understand the economics of farming and work hand in hand together.
And I think a recognition that we need land for a whole bunch more than just food production. If you just look at land in terms of its ability to produce food, then you're going to miss a whole bunch of other benefits that society needs. And for example, sponge landscapes are absolutely vital in sequestering rainfall and storing it and purifying it and releasing it slowly through the dry summer, whilst at the same time protecting communities from flash flooding in the winter. And once you start considering land in terms of all the different things it can offer, in terms of hydrology, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of carbon, amenity, and food, then a different set of uses perhaps start to become more obvious. And that's why I think the announcement by Steve Reed, the Secretary of State, DEFRA, of a national conversation around land use with the resulting plan for a national land use framework, I think it's a really, really good idea to inform how we use our incentives. Because this idea that our national parks are sheep ranches and that's all we should do with them, and it's always been that way, is not only wrong, but it's also incorrect, factually incorrect. If you traveled across Kent in the 1930s, it was all hops. Then the 1980s, it's all market gardens, vegetables, fruits, orchards. And now, of course, people are switching to wine. Farmers are innovators and landscape uses change all the time. And so I think government really needs to be about creating incentives so that we do get the best value out of our land. And that may be a prioritization of nature recovery and all the advantages it brings in places like the Lake District. What worries me specifically about the Lake District, because it is kind of emblematic of this struggle, where you've got on one side those who say that the Lake District must be a very large sheep monoculture, and that's all because that's all it's ever been, ignoring the fact that sheep numbers are vastly higher now than they were, say, 100 years ago, against those who say there should be a greater diversity of uses of the land there and more nature in that landscape. But of course, the Lake District's now secured World Heritage status on the basis of its cultural value as a huge sheep ranch, which I think was quite a clever move by those who don't want any change to the status quo in the Lake District. So how does the National Trust grapple with that? It's easier for you at a place like Holnacut than it is in a place like the Lake District to be part of the change that is inevitably coming. You get enormous grief when you change a tenancy. For example, you one tenant retires and moves on, and you bring in a new young couple who want to farm in a different way, and they want to switch away from sheep to cattle, and they want to have a beef box scheme, and they want to have nature, and they want to be in the environmental land management scheme and so on, and everyone goes crazy. Or worse, you allow a tenancy to retire, and then you take the land back in hand and do a bunch of nature recovery work as you're doing at Holnacut. Again, you're on the front page of the Daily Mail getting criticized, or the Telegraph. We're all going to starve because of the National Trust. And if we don't starve, we're going to be eaten by the beavers or what have you. How do you deal with that? The cultural conundrum is where it's at.
Okay, let me go back even further in history. Can I go back to the other great moment in the history of the world where civilization took off and the nature of the way we deal with the environment changed dramatically? And of course, I'm going back now 10,000 years to when agriculture emerged. And you've talked to our friend Henry Dimbleby about his work on food. Well, if you look back 10,000 years ago, he's shown that actually wild animals were by far the biggest proportion of biomass of animals on land. And that over time, what's happened is they have been pressed further and further away. They've been a much smaller proportion. And now they're outweighed by a factor of 10 to 1 by animals that we use to produce food and products for us. We know that ecosystems are terribly, terribly complex. And it's like one of those games of sticks. We keep taking away a piece of it. We keep taking away a piece of it. At some point, that system will collapse, and it will actually come back and affect our ability to produce food. The Industrial Revolution kind of added afterburners to our agricultural exploitation because we had machines in there to do the work that animals and people were doing before. And so we began to exploit land on a greater scale with specialization, with monocultures. We began to do things that we're now beginning to see the consequences of. Then, just as they saw the consequences at the end of the 19th century of industrialization, so we're seeing now the consequences in our environment of the industrialization of agriculture. So I do think we have to stop and realize it's all about the longer term. This is not sustainable. And the way we need to change that is to get people to realize sustainability isn't just about exploitation of the natural world. It's about our attitude of mind and the time frames that we think in. So helping people to understand, visualize what's going to happen over the long term if we continue down this path, if our soils degrade, if our water continues to be poor, I think is the way to get them to say, because we all care about our children, get them to actually say, hang on, if this is not sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you've been to Groundswell. It's kind of like Glastonbury for farmers.
I'm going to go this year. I haven't been yet. Tell me about it.
Yeah, or the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which took place in January in Oxford alongside the actual Oxford Farming Conference. And there are an enormous number of young would-be farmers who just can't get onto the ladder. They can't get hold of land. And a lot of them have some pretty exciting ideas about farming hand in hand with nature. I mean, the membership of the Nature Friendly Farming Network is exploding. They've got thousands of farmer members. So there is this kind of generational shift happening in farming. And as you say, we need to improve the state of nature and rebuild soil across all of our land. But that doesn't mean that we need to prioritize food production on all of our land. I think it's perfectly possible to envisage a future in our less productive, remoter landscapes, the kind of places where the National Trust has a lot of land, in which farmers are prioritizing nature recovery and environmental services and amenity, but they are continuing to produce food in a way that runs with the grain of that desire. So grazing native cattle in an extensive way, in the traditional way, low densities, out all year on the hillside, is the perfect way to bring about nature recovery. And it's an easier life as compared with sheep ranching, which is a kind of 16-hour a day, 7-day a week job in which 10% of the sheep die of exposure every year. So I think we have to be kind of honest about it. Is the old paradigm of sheep monocultures in our less productive landscapes has got to change. It just has to.
And of course, in order to get the same amount of output, we increase the energy, the pesticides, the nitrogen that we put into the soil, which then runs off into the river and creates downstream problems. I talked to the head of the EA, the environmental agency, the other day, and he said, well, it's really good. You talk a lot about water in your strategy. You need to talk more about soil. Soil is really important for retaining water, actually, that helps us deal with drought and helps us deal with downstream flooding. It's actually getting this bigger inclusive picture with all of the holistic externalities included and priced in some way. That economics is really important, and our economic models don't reflect that now.
So I'm interested in your ink blot strategy. I visited Killerton not so long ago in Devon, and beautiful old house. We used to belong to the Ackland family, and amazing views, and a tremendously exciting nature recovery plan there as well on some pretty low productivity farmland, working with at least one of the tenants so far to do that. And what I learned at Killerton is that the National Trust thinks about nature recovery in terms of ink blots, kind of following the John Lawton bigger, better, more joined up script. So how will you do that? Because the National Trust has a presence in a number of places up and down the country. And I suppose you can imagine a scenario in which those areas controlled by the National Trust become kind of core areas for good management and nature restoration. And then through the judicial use of government incentives and partnerships with neighbors, you can imagine corridors stretching outwards, north, south, east, west. Is that kind of how you think about it?
Ben, that's absolutely right. You've been to Purbeck and you know what's going on there. So just this last week, we've talked about 380 hectares of a wildlife-rich habitat, which we're restoring with government support. So that means tree planting, restoring wood pasture, and this is going to bring back all the songbirds. But this is just one chunk of a much bigger project, which involves Natural England, RSPB, lots of smaller trusts. We're trying to create a 3,300 hectare priority area linked up landscape. And you're right about the bringing in these species that we don't normally associate with grazing, old rare breed pigs, red Devon cattle, old ponies, to kind of mimic the previous grazing behavior of oryx and tarpon horses and wild boars. And of course, they spread the seeds around and they poach the earth. These bigger, better, more joined up, connected areas are more resilient, and they do have a knock-on effect for the wider countryside. The Fens is another great example. I know you know about the work we're doing there. The 2 acres in the Fens was the first acquisition of the National Trust. I was involved in a trust 20 years ago, Tubney, and we're trying to grow a 50 square kilometer area, which will be an amazing habitat for new birds that come in. We have something like 1,000 acres now, and we have 9,000 different species that we've identified in it. We're getting the birds, the migrating birds coming in the spring. We're getting all kinds of animals that have lived there traditionally. And the thing we're doing mostly, it's re-wetting it in the winter, getting some grazing in there, and actually getting people out to it too. We're providing boardwalks for people to go out and see, wow, this is an amazing place.
Yeah, Purbeck is another astonishing project. I mean, the scale of that is just beyond. And of course, it's right there on Poole Harbour, which is one of the most important nature sites in Britain. And looking from a boat, I went with Wild Justice on a bird watching boat, and they wanted to network and meet a bunch of people. In fact, I met Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, on that trip, and she was charming. And you look back towards the land, and it just goes on and on and on. This habitat under restoration. You can glimpse the cattle, and I'm told there are beavers now back in that landscape, living outside of fences. So that's a perfect example of a kind of ink blot. And does land purchase play a part? I mean, will the National Trust continue to be bold in terms of buying strategically bits of land that people want to sell in and around these ink blots?
Absolutely. And we may do that in collaboration with others. One of the things, because we're thinking from the outside in, we may actually support other people's acquisitions. We may actually help incentivize people to do things off our land. And we will, our aim is to move from having restored 25,000 acres this last time. We're going to do in the next 10 years, 250,000 acres. And some of that will be on our land. Some of it won't be. Some of it will be new acquisitions. We'll be looking, obviously, for philanthropists and other far-seeing landowners to actually help us with that and hopefully even contribute some funds so we can buy some more land.
We see in the media quite a lot of attacks on the National Trust, specifically from this entity that I had to look it up beforehand, the Restore Trust. And, I see that their motions tend to fail when it comes to a vote of the members. But you get accused as an organization, particularly in the right-wing press, of being woke, of operating contrary to the prevailing political winds, which are against woke. I don't necessarily want to talk about the sort of decolonization agenda within your built environment, because it's not really the topic of this podcast. But I don't quite see how restoring rivers and rebuilding nature in our landscapes and restoring the kind of vibrancy that the Victorians would have once known well in this country could be considered woke, but it seems to be. So is that a risk? Is there a risk that the National Trust gets bullied into watering down its nature recovery plans?
I don't think so. We're independent. We have a good governance structure with a council that appoints trustees. And we're there in response to our members. We listen to them every year. We care about what they think. We've just done a consultation of 70,000 people, including our members. The National Trust is one of the most trusted and highly regarded organizations in the country. We've always been about public benefit. We've always been about the nation and everyone. We've always been about nature, beauty, and history together for everyone, forever. How can anyone object to trying to look after those things for future generations? And to involve people, they need to see themselves in that landscape, both the built landscape, the historical landscape, and the natural landscape. So we need to get more people caring about this stuff if we want them to look after it, and not to be a specialist concern for just one segment of society. But hey, criticize us. Tell us what we're doing wrong. I have no problem with people taking us to task and telling us, you could do better, you could do more. And I'd say, yes, we can. Come and tell us what we're doing wrong now, please.
Yeah, because I mean, we really don't want nature to get sucked into the vortex of the culture wars around those other topics. And it does feel, when it comes to National Trust, to be happening a little bit, feels to me like a bit of a risk. And the risk seems to come from people who want all of our landscapes to be a factory floor for food, only food, who haven't given thought to what else we want from our land. But thankfully, the National Trust is doing that thinking and is prioritizing in the right way on its land and is being brave and ambitious and taking the flak. And as a member, since I was a teenager, I am hugely grateful to the National Trust for doing that. Rene, you're a British citizen, but you were born in Oregon, the Beaver State. I'd just love to know a little bit about your own personal love of nature, because periodically I'm on a walk, maybe I'm at Stour Head, which is the National Trust property closest to me in Somerset, and I pause and I really give thanks that the National Trust has a chair that is so in love with nature. Where does that come from?
Well, you and I are very, very lucky. You can step outside your door where you live and we're in nature. We have to remember that something like 40% of the population, an increasing percentage, don't have access to those green spaces, which are revitalizing and which you and I take for granted and know are really important to our well-being. And that's part of our issue. Is I grew up thinking I was a poor, underprivileged kid in a rural area, and have since realized I grew up, with a wealth of nature and a wealth of things to do around me. I worked hard on the farm. I thought of it as basically a harsh environment. And then every once in a while, I go with my uncle, who was a wildlife photographer, on a hike. Or I'd go with my dad to Yosemite, and suddenly another bit of my brain switched on, and I could see how wonderful, beautiful, complex, and interesting this was. It's the complexity of the natural world just never ceases to amaze me. It's fractals all the way down. It's basically everything. Unpeel it, and you learn something new about the interrelationships of ecosystems. And I think that early, I lost that, and then I came across to the UK when I was about 27, and I thought, gosh, This is a country that lets people walk pretty much anywhere they want to go. You can walk across the countryside, and they care about how it looks. They care about their past. And that revitalized my love of nature. And now I live in the countryside. I couldn't imagine living in a city, living without the birds and the bees and the nature and the animals surrounding me, Ben. I just don't know how anybody can. And I want everybody to enjoy the things that you and I we don't take for granted, but we know are so precious to our lives.
Yeah, time spent in nature is absolutely essential to me as well. And through difficult times, everyone has difficult times in their life, in grief or whatever. During those times, for me, nature has been literally a lifesaver. And I think this is what the National Trust does, which is most important, more important than anything else, is make it possible for people all over the country to get out into nature and into places where proper nature recovery is happening.
That's why our strategy is called People and Nature Thriving Together. Because we're part of nature. We think too much about ourselves as information systems, and we're basically wetware. We're basically part of nature, and all the better for it. How exciting that is, and how lovely it is that we are that.
Exactly. And the National Trust is bringing to people's attention what nature is. It's bringing people into connection with nature and educating them on what nature is. This idea that a sheep-wrecked hillside with nothing but sheep isn't necessarily all it's cracked up to be. And when you go to Stourhead and you see wetlands at the top of the River Wylie starting to reform, and you see egrets flying low over the landscape, and you see the work of beavers, and you see all this stuff happening, and you start to realize that actually we can have wildlife in this country. We don't need to go abroad for it. Rene, we are so lucky to have you as chair of the National Trust. We're so lucky to have the National Trust. It is, I think, the most important nature restoration organization in Britain today. I am grateful really from the bottom of my heart for everything you do. I'm so happy to have spent this time talking to you. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And I hope you'll spread the word about the podcast because the numbers are growing and we want to get these stories out to as many people as possible.
I will, Ben, and I hope you and I can continue this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
I feel so lucky to have got Rene, chair of the National Trust, to come on the podcast. He really has been an extraordinary driving force for nature recovery within one of England's most traditional and establishment and largest charities, such that the National Trust, I think, is one of the most important forces for rewilding now in this country. If you enjoyed the conversation I had with Rene as much as I enjoyed having it, I'd be hugely grateful if you'd spread the word, and not just on whatever platform you use to get your podcast, but with work colleagues or friends who are interested in nature and rewilding and who want a dose of optimism in their lives every fortnight. Any WhatsApp or social media groups you're in, it all makes a huge difference, and numbers are growing, and that's because of people sharing it. So thank you very much for that. Next time I'm going to be talking to Pete Cairns from Scotland, The Big Picture, about some of these extraordinary wildlife stories that have occurred in the Highlands in recent weeks. The appearance of some seemingly tame lynx, native lynx, on the mountainside at Aviemore in Scotland. Some wild boar have appeared, and it seems like interesting things are afoot. Pete is going to enlighten us, having been at the centre of the rewilding conversation in Scotland for decades.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about the series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.